As we've covered so many angles today of daily fantasy, we're now going to hit the regulatory angle. We have an esteemed panel here with a current Attorney General, a former Attorney General, and some people prominent in the industry. So I'm just going to turn it over to the co-chair of the Attorney General practice at Cozen O'Connor, Ms. Lori Kalani, and she'll welcome the panel.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around. I know this is the last panel on a Friday, so I appreciate everybody staying. Let me start with introductions. I'm joined here by a panel of very impressive people. I have General Brnovich from the state of Arizona. Next to me, to his left, is Martha Coakley, the former Attorney General of Massachusetts, a partner at Foley Hoag in Boston. Gary Slaiman with Morgan Lewis out of Washington, D.C., and Bill Ryan, formerly with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office and currently the chairman of the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board. Oh, sorry.
I'm a commissioner now.
Oh, sorry, Commissioner.
That's okay.
I give everybody a raise, so sorry about that promotion. So, you know, it's interesting. I heard a lot of interesting comments here today, and I think we have an interesting panel because, like the legal panel, there's no right or wrong answer here, and like the topic today, a changing game. I think that everything is changing day to day, and like David Apfel said, pre-October 1st, everything was quiet. We were representing, our firm represents DraftKings, and there was not a single AG complaint out in the country that we were aware of. And then, you know, post October 1st, I actually still believe today that there's probably less than 5 Attorney General complaints that have come into offices about consumers having issues with the technology and with the game. But obviously, we're in a very, very different place today, and a lot of action in the states. And let me say that, you know, there's a lot of action that's been taking place, and if we fast forward to a year from now, that we'll probably have a very different story to tell about all the different regulatory action that's been taken. So today I want to discuss sort of where we've been in the past 6 months or 4 months, and what we think might take place over the next year, and I'd love to get some opinions about what we think is appropriate, because I think we all have different experiences, and we all probably have some different thoughts on what we think is appropriate. Let me just give a quick overview of sort of some current regulatory landscape and what's taken place. In 2015, Kansas passed some legislation that exempted fantasy sports from the definition of a bet in the gaming laws. That legislation imposed no regulatory scheme whatsoever. It was silent with respect to regulation. More recently, as I think Adam said earlier, Virginia and Indiana both passed legislation that imposed different regulation on the game. Virginia had some regulation. Indiana had also some regulation, in fact, a bit more regulation. There's about 20 additional states right now that have legislation pending that all have some form of regulation. In Pennsylvania, there was the legislature passed a bill that requires the Gaming Control Board to submit a report to the legislature on fantasy sports, which we'll talk about as well. And then last week, Massachusetts, which was big news, finalized their consumer protection regulations coming out of the AG's office, and those are very detailed regulations and very thoughtful that will regulate the DFS industry, and I want to talk a lot about those. But let me start with General Brnovich. General, you have experience regulating different industries, first as former director of the Department of Gaming in Arizona and currently as the Attorney General. So tell me why you believe a government entity would need to take steps to regulate this industry.
Well, let me begin by saying thank you very much for Lori for having me here today, and to Jeff for inviting me, and for all the people that are sitting here today. I know we're the last panel, and sometimes that's tough. I couldn't help but think, as you were talking about this distinguished panel, at this point I feel a little bit like Larry Fortensky. And does anybody know who Larry Fortensky is? Okay, I see a lot of head shaking now. Larry Fortensky was Elizabeth Taylor's 7th husband. And at this point, I feel like everything that has been said and done, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do anything that will impress the crowd here today. So, but I do think, I come at this from this perspective. When I was an assistant United States attorney in Arizona, I prosecuted the largest gambling crimes in Arizona history. I was the state gaming director. As a state agent, I represented the Arizona Department of Gaming in negotiations with our Native American tribes on gaming compacts. So I have a lot of experience in this area from a lot of different perspectives. And one thing that I think history has taught me personally, and if you look at the history of gambling, is, and I know there are people in the daily fantasy sports industry that don't consider gambling. I know there was a panel on skill versus chance, but anytime you have a cash-intensive industry, whether it's banking, whether it's gaming, whatever that industry is, it tends to attract moths, like moths to a flame. Gaming, banking, cash-intensive industries attract crime, crooks, corruption. And so I would submit that they need to be well regulated. And what history has taught us, when you have these cash-intensive industries and they're not regulated, you end up with problems, you end up with scandals, and you end up with the public losing confidence in those institutions regardless of what they are. And so, I mean, there's places like, Ben Franklin had organized a lottery here in Pennsylvania. Lotteries were used to finance the Revolutionary War. But then there were scandals and there was corruption and all sorts of associated problems with gambling, and then the public said, no, we don't want it. So we've always had this ebb and flow throughout our history. So regardless of whether you think DFS is skill, chance, gambling, not gambling, we know it's a cash-intensive industry and it should be regulated. I have always been a big believer that when it comes to traditional or inherent police powers of the state, those should be left to the states and not the federal government. So I've always been a proponent that it should be left up to the 50 individual laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis said, to decide how and what types of daily fantasy sports they would allow or not allow, and it should be left up to the respective states to determine, how much or how little regulation they truly want.
But when you're talking about a nascent industry like this and 50 different states, do you stunt an industry? And I'll let General Coakley answer that question. Are you essentially stunting an industry by saying, okay, Tennessee's going to have these regulations, and I'm not suggesting that it's right or wrong, but Illinois will have these regulations, and how does a company that's very technology driven have 150 engineers hired just to implement all of those regulations, or is there a way to deal with that and to solve for that?
Well, and so that's and again, thanks to Villanova for this, because some fascinating insight today. I have been an attorney general for 8 years, a year ago, and then became involved with working with DraftKings last August. They're based in Boston. I met the owners. They're young, smart guys with a great consumer tech platform. And as I saw some of what was happening with the increase in advertising, I said, I can help you with this landscape a little bit on how AGs think about this, because if they're not doing it yet, they will be when newspapers are saying, how come AG of state X or Y, you're not doing anything about this? And so it did in the last really 6 months just explode in terms of consciousness, even though it'd been around. But I would phrase it this way. Whether it's legal or not. Remember, there's legal gambling and illegal gambling, so it's no conclusion to say whether it's gambling or not. To say it's a game of skill or chance is a first-year legal problem. What really we should be looking at is your law review article, law students, and your business about how we see this new industry, and as you heard from the last panel, the business platforms that are going to come out of it. And I'm thinking, in 10 years, we'll be sitting in the ballpark with those little screens in front of us, like on your JetBlue flight, and you'll be wagering in Bitcoin. And so how we look at these new industries and what that model is and how we safely regulate it is challenging, and that process is underway. And I would recommend to you, for instance, for law students particularly, or if you can't fall asleep at night, take a look at the regulations that Massachusetts has generated. They are thorough. They address the things the Attorney General was concerned about. They fall into 3 buckets, really. Kids, making sure people under 21, and she was firm about that the advertising to minors is regulated. It's about fairness in that we talked a little bit about the sharks and minnows problem. How is this going to be fair to consumers? And the third thing it really addresses is fairness to people with with behavioral problems, compulsive players, for instance. And I think you'll see if you look at those regulations as a sausage that came out of a great discussion with our attorney, my former office, the Attorney General's Office of Massachusetts, the players in the industry, those who don't like any kind of gaming, those who didn't like this kind of gaming, and others, to say, what is it that we do? And it wasn't so much about we need our piece of the pie that I think has driven some regulation in some states, Nevada may be one of those, but more so from a consumer protection angle. What are the evils we're concerned about? What are the things we need to address? And that is a process that I think works. Other states are looking at legislation. I would just say regulations give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of as the games develop, as other games develop. And I will also credit our gaming commission, who was asked to do a report, I think David mentioned earlier, and their question was not whether it's legal or not, but do we want it in our state? And if we do, what are going to be the rules of the road for it? And it was an intensive, good process that I think allows this industry to move forward in Massachusetts, and I hope in other states, and I hope other states will take a look at that process for fairness. But getting the input of the industry is important, whether they're going to do regulations around consumer financing, around not-for-profit colleges, around mortgages, and keeping in mind that the technology piece is really important, that your legislators and your regulators understand what's happening.
Martha, if the legislature were to act in Massachusetts, or if the AG's office decided that those regulations needed to be tweaked as they learn more as another year goes by, would the legislature change those, or would the AG's office change those?
Well, either option. The legislature could certainly act if they wanted to give authority for regulation to a gaming commission. That would have to, certain things would have to come from the legislature. But I think that the legislature has left the consumer protection piece to the Attorney General. And I think we could see a need as the games evolve or other issues arise, that either the legislature or the Attorney General could approach it. But I think the important thing is, what is it that we're trying to accomplish to keep this game safe and fair? And I've said that this business model in daily fantasy sports is not going to succeed unless the people who play it are convinced that it's transparent and fair. This is not like regulating a utility or a bank. People choose to play. They choose to get involved. They're going to demand that of the model. And I think both FanDuel and DraftKings and the other players in the industry understand that. And that's where it's important for the regulators and the legislators to understand what it is they're trying to address before they issue regulations. I think that's happened in Massachusetts. We DraftKings don't agree with everything that they have regulated, but they understand it, they're gonna comply, and that allows for fairness in the industry too. You wanna make sure that your consumers are protected, but that you keep out the bad players in the industry, the kinds of things we just talked about in the earlier panel. If you're gonna regulate it and it's fair, and your regulatory body is fair and free from corruption, then that's the best way to go.
But let us not forget, as Mark Twain once said, that no person's life, liberty, or property is safe while the legislature is in session.
Very good, very good point. Bill, can you talk a little bit about the report that you all are putting together? What can you tell us about that, and what focus? I know that the legislature laid out what you need to look at, but can you give us a little bit more insight on what you expect that report to say?
I can give you some. Again, my name is Bill Ryan. I am one of the 7 commissioners on the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board here in Pennsylvania. And what we do by law on the gaming board, we're all independent. What we do is regulate the 12 casinos that we have right now in the state of Pennsylvania. That's all we're charged with doing. Anybody who knows anything about casinos knows how heavily they are regulated. I say to people that the only industry that may be more regulated in Pennsylvania than casinos, nuclear power would be it. And for that reason, perhaps a couple of weeks ago, Act 7 of 2016 became law, which very briefly states that the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board shall submit a report to the General Assembly on the potential of fantasy sports as a gambling product in this Commonwealth. In compiling the report, the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board shall consider and address the following: There are 10 issues, a couple of them, ladies and gentlemen. One, a definition of fantasy sports, the structure of the different fantasy sports formats and the underlying activities that may be appropriate for oversight, how regulation of fantasy sports would fit into the Commonwealth's current gambling laws and policies, compulsive and problem gambling, protection of minors, safeguards and mechanisms to ensure the reporting of gambling winnings and facilitate the collection of taxes, recommendations for legislative action, and then the good old catch-all, any other information related to the conduct and operation of fantasy sports as the board may deem appropriate. So basically, I think what the General Assembly is telling the board is okay with fantasy sports, what's going on, and what do we do about it here in Pennsylvania? Which is a great question. Fortunately, we don't have to get back to the General Assembly until the end of May. And all of you, I think, today have heard the differing versions of regulation. In Pennsylvania, because I'm only one of 7, I can only speak rather carefully about what we're going to recommend. But clearly, the question has to be asked, is regulation necessary? If it is, next question is, who's going to do it? How much regulation is enough? How much is too much? And then the questions go on to the specifics, most of which you know. But right now, we're in the beginning phases. It's going to be interesting. And there's no question that this is now, that is fantasy sports, is gone from being just about nowhere in the public mind to being right there front and center. So not only Pennsylvania, obviously, but across the country, we're all going to have to deal with it.
Is your agency going to meet with the parties and with the industry to learn more, or how are they going to form the basis of their study?
Well, yes, our staff, we will do whatever we have to make sure we're as informed as we have to be to give the General Assembly an intelligent product. So I would expect that we will be meeting with the industry, and the report will be, I assure everybody, thorough.
Gary, earlier in the year, Congressman Pallone and Menendez and Senator Menendez wrote a letter to the FTC asking them to investigate, and so can you give us an update on where that is, or have you heard anything, and where do you expect that to go, perhaps?
So they did write the letter. The FTC has authority, particularly on the FTC has both competition and consumer protection authority. On the consumer protection side, they would have authority, and they think they have current authority under the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices in respect to advertising and things that companies or any industry does in terms of informing the public about their business. So the question that came from the Congress was, are you aware of this? Are you paying attention? Do you have adequate authority? And I think the answer has been, we are aware of it. We're paying attention. We have adequate authority. I'm not aware of any further activity in that regard, other than that they're monitoring it. And from time to time, when those questions come up in the public arena, the chairman and other members of the commission have said, we will monitor and use our authority as necessary.
So I have a question for the AG types here, and oftentimes I do all my work in the AG arena, and oftentimes AGs are able to, what I would say, regulate 50 states by entering into what I would say is a multi-state investigation. They investigate a company or an industry, they dig deep, they figure out what your practices are, and then they come back, they work together, they form a steering committee or an executive committee. It's a bipartisan effort, and they sit down with the company or the companies, and they say, here's how we want you to change your business practices. And there's a consent decree that comes out of that, or a settlement agreement, and that's essentially a form of regulation. And And I just would love to get your opinion on why that hasn't been the case here. It seems to me that what Massachusetts has done is it looks a lot like what a consent decree or an ABC with assurance of voluntary compliance would look like. I have a stack like this that we've negotiated over the years with different companies that look very much like those regulations. And so I'd be interested to hear from Mark and Martha and even Bill on that about why you think that that's not a way to perhaps solve this, rather than having piecemeal legislatures pass bills that either regulate within the bill or give the authority to a regulatory body within their states.
I'll take a step of that. Some of it, I think, is that this is a new thing. Depending on how you look at it, it looks maybe like gambling. If you look at it another way, it looks like consumer tech. It looks like a game. It looks like an extension of rotisserie baseball. Depends on how you look at it. And frankly, most AGs don't have sports regulatory divisions. Some states have gambling, some have none. And the cultural and the legal context for states to look at whether what this thing is and what we do with it has been very different. And I think when you see most of the states that fit into the material element category that we heard about, their language is pretty much the same, and they've reached very different conclusions based upon whether there's case law or not, the opinion of the AG, how people feel about this. And so I think the response to this has been very quick. It has been very emotional in some ways, and it hasn't, unlike when the mortgage crisis occurred, and all states were facing the same thing, with an established industry and trade practices, they could all say, and bring claims. We have claims we can bring against Wall Street banks. We have claims we can bring against for-profit schools. That's not the case here, where people have been deciding, well, you're either legal or you're not. I think probably too quickly in most instances. But more importantly, even if they say, well, okay, maybe you're legal, but we don't know what to do with you. And I think that's been part of the process. It's been a very, if you think of it, 6 months in an AG's lifetime is a nanosecond, right, General? It's just, it's
It seems like 6 minutes
yeah, it's
underwater.
It's a very, well, we'll get you some snorkels, okay? It's a very short period of time for an AG's office to, never mind for a bunch of AGs to get together, because they are working on other things, and this has not been on the forefront. And I think people have been saying, what do we do with this? And this is where I will credit the association, with FanDuel and DraftKings and all the other players saying, look, we want a fair game, we want to have our players play. We come to you, and you know this, Lori, because they made an effort in every state to say, ask us your questions, here we are, this is what we're doing. They were being very transparent. And I think, you will see in 6 months a very different scenario here. I think some of these issues will be resolved. I'm hopeful they will be resolved in a way that let the industry operate, but fairly for consumers. And that's really the issue for AGs. How do we make this fair in our state for consumers? Like the FTC, that's the main focus of a local AG's or a legislative office, unless legislation is looking for registration fees, is looking for revenue streams.
Yeah, I do think that, just kind of dovetailing off those remarks, is that you haven't seen these huge problems or the major scandals. I mean, there was the one that there was with the one employee at one of the sites that was wagering on the other site. But for the most part, you haven't seen somebody lose their mortgage, or cases we've had where people have embezzled sometimes millions of dollars from employers in order to subsidize their gambling habit. We haven't really seen that. But I think the other factor is that I know, even in our office, there are people that were involved in March Madness pools, and people's attitudes towards well, as long as the third party's not taking a cut, it's legal, and I've always maintained that even as gaming director. The point, though, is that people's attitudes toward gambling have changed so dramatically that people don't necessarily see this as an issue, or even, we don't even call it gambling, we call it gaming or now skill, and it's interesting because if you look at the history of the way gambling evolved, even the most recent trends, when New Hampshire, I would submit, kicked off the latest kind of gaming craze when they approved the lottery in '64, it took 10 years because people were so apprehensive for that lottery to finally pass. And then New York did it in '67. And all these states now have every state but Utah and Hawaii has some form of gambling, essentially. And so people's attitudes have changed dramatically, and there's just not that pressure where people see this and think, oh my gosh, this is something wrong, we need to do something about it. Because I think most people just have a general reaction of like, oh, that's cool, fantasy sports and March Madness pools. Like, people just don't see it as a problem, because I don't think we've seen the horror stories, or we haven't, like, seen people lose their mortgage, and people are willing to accept it. I do think also, though, there has always been this trend historically in government, and as I said, I'm a big believer that I think this is something that should be left up to the individual states, but I think sometimes in government you end up with this attitude where if they see an industry, the first impulse is to regulate it. If it moves, regulate it. If it keeps moving, you tax it, and then if it stops moving, you subsidize it. And so sometimes that's kind of the cycle of what happens within government. And so, who knows, because this is such a newer, industry on a national or international basis, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves as far as not only the regulation, but what the states and even the federal government decide to do with taxation and everything else.
And it is a popular game. People who play it love it. And we found, meeting with legislators, that many of them they played with their kids, they played with their college roommates across the country, some played with their fathers, and so it was a bonding experience that they enjoyed for every kid who didn't make it past Pee Wee football, or played high school but not college, or played college, and that's true of men and women who weren't able to do it. This is a fun game, right? You get to put your team together, you get engaged, and it's on that platform that I think people who don't understand it, who want to regulate it, overreacted to without understanding it. I just noticed Massachusetts was legalizing casino gaming recently. We'd never had it in Massachusetts. I was the Attorney General at the time. I found that when you were out speaking, if someone called it gaming, they were in favor of it. If they called it gambling, they were not. And so the words we use and the termination, terms we use really indicate what people's attitudes are. But I think you're right. Just as all of these platforms, the way we communicate, the way we use technology has changed the way people think. It's generational, and it is what the cultural sense is. Many people who are very progressive hate gambling. And so this kind of discussion makes for very odd bedfellows as we talk about where this industry goes moving forward.
And I think the reality is that whether it is or is not gambling, fantasy sports seems like it's gambling to a lot of people. And it's gotten big, it's gotten a lot of attention. And as a person who worked in an Attorney General's office and was involved in consumer protection issues, consumer protection offices are great to respond to problems. But if you have a big issue that could cause a lot of problems for people who are at risk, then the legislature start talking regulation. The one thing regulation can do, if it's done right, it can prevent things from happening, so you don't need the Attorney General to come in to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, which, as Martha knows well, oftentimes the Attorney General can't. The loss is too great, the money's not there. So I think there is a realistic issue here, and whether at the end of the day there is heavy regulation, little regulation, no regulation, that's a legitimate point. But certainly fantasy sports now have gotten to the point where every state in the country is going to have to really look at this issue, and perhaps eventually even the federal government is going to have to, because so many of these new gambits we see are going national because of the internet. The internet has made a morass out of gambling, out of a lot of things. But the regulation of certain facets of the industry, I think it's just something everybody has to deal with.
That's a good point about the federal government, Gary. Besides the FTC, I know that we talked about the FTC, but Congressman Plone also asked for a hearing in Energy and Commerce, and I know that they've been busy on the Hill with some other things. Do you see that hearing happening this year or next year, or what are your predictions? Because I know it's so easy to predict what the Hill will do.
So just a little background. I've worked in the Senate Judiciary Committee for many years, and the one thing no matter what we talk about the states doing, is the federal government and the Congress has oversight authority when they choose to provide oversight. And I think partly what was motivating Congressman Malone was exercising oversight function. Partly he has his own issues about what's going on in New Jersey on issues that are related, but really frankly tangential in some ways to fantasy. But he saw fantasy, saw the activity around it, and it sparked an interest. He's the ranking Democrat on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is appropriate authority over those issues. And so he asked for a hearing. The chairman of the committee, Fred Upton, has said, if you want to have a hearing, we want to have some oversight, that's an appropriate function, and has said that the committee will do a hearing. As you say, Lori, there's so much activity right now in Congress, and it's an incredibly short session given the election. It's unclear when it'll happen, but there's a commitment by the chairman to have it. So, at some point, you'll see a hearing on the subject. We don't know when.
You think it'll be this year?
It's well possible this year. I think the expectation is it'll be this year. But it'll be in the subcommittee of Energy and Commerce. I know they've got a pretty robust agenda of hearings. It's just a question of fitting it in, and so it'll be to the chairman to decide that.
I do think it's really fascinating, interesting to me. I used to also work at a think tank, so I like the whole academic law school atmosphere here, and it reminds me that we especially for the law students, we accept this notion that, of course, the federal government has the authority and the ability to regulate this area. And I couldn't help but think that, in 1903, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case, Champion v. Ames, that dealt with, Congress had passed a law prohibiting the interstate transportation of lottery tickets in the U.S. mail. And that was a 5-4 decision. It was a divided court. It was a hotly contested issue whether Congress had the authority under the Commerce Clause to regulate the transportation of lottery tickets, the U.S. mail, from one jurisdiction where they were illegal to another jurisdiction where they were illegal. And it's interesting because that case, the court talked about these areas, gambling, this is traditional police powers, public morals, public health, safety, welfare, were areas where we didn't think the federal government should be coming in and dictating to the states what they should do. It should be left to the states. But that case was a 5-4 decision, and because those lottery tickets were being transported across state lines, the court decided that indeed that statute was constitutional. But that was a close call, and we've gone from that in 100 years where we just accept the notion that the federal government can use the authority under the Commerce Clause to regulate essentially everything they want. Just a little side note there related to gambling. So you're a professor. Remember about the Commerce Clause. I don't think the framers wanted it expanded that broadly for all the lawsuits.
I love the way he throws in his history. It's unbelievable. It's good. That's good, Mark. After a red-eye flight, that's even.
It was related to gambling.
Yeah, no, that was good. So I have 2 comments. One, I was just thinking about MySpace, and I represent Facebook, and Facebook's done a great job of regulating themselves and working with government on regulation. And MySpace was an example of sort of an icky environment when there was no regulation out there. And so I think looking back, that's a good lesson where there was no regulation in the very beginning, and that did not bode well for the company. And so to have regulation and have consumer confidence and transparency, like Martha said, is a very good thing. And so you want to say something.
Laura, that's a good point. How many even remember MySpace, right? That's ancient history. And they came in at the time and said, we can't do age verification. We don't have the technological ability to do it, which I didn't think was really accurate.
Use fake names, remember?
And they didn't want to do it. But the key thing was, could they identify that predators, for instance, weren't getting on this space? And so they didn't survive because they didn't develop the technology and they didn't work with regulators appropriately. Some of those analogies are true. And if you look at the mass regs, you will see that in order to comply with them, in terms of verification of users, certain of the technical requirements of them require the development of those technological platforms in order to comply. And that's a big difference than even 5 years ago. So, and I'm sure it will be different in a year or two. We see it with the Apple issue with the FBI. We see technology continuing outpacing government, frankly. In order to regulate those things, we need to understand where that technology is going.
And we see the mass regs, and I should mention that a lot of these regs were already in place with FanDuel and DraftKings, and there are more players in the marketplace. Those are the dominant players, but there are lots of other companies, and so a lot of the things that you see there, the companies were already doing, and there are other companies out there who will obviously need to comply, but they were verifying age and name, and so they will continue to do that. Earlier on the panel, I think it was Jeff that said, I think he called the companies a technology company. And one of the panelists did, but I think it was Jeff, and I thought that's actually the way I think of DraftKings and FanDuel as technology companies. I think fantasy sports have been around for a long time. When I was in college 30 years ago, my boyfriend was playing fantasy sports, and now it's daily fantasy sports because there's technology infused, and we can do things in shorter spurts and more often. And so I think of this as this, disruptive technology, and it changes the game, and I don't suggest that it doesn't need regulation of some sort, but it reminds me of the Uber problem, and I've worked with Uber for a long time, and there's always a question of where does the regulation belong? Where should the regulation live? And some people say that the taxi cab authority should regulate Uber, and how many of you would raise your hand and say, yeah, a taxi cab authority should regulate Uber? And I would say no, that Uber's not a taxi cab business, and they're far from it. They're a technology company. And so, as we think about this, I know that Mark and I were talking about this. General Brnovich and I were talking about this earlier, and he was saying, well, I think it belongs in the Department of Gaming, and you had some very good reasons as to why. But I'd be very interested in everybody's opinion on where regulation of daily fantasy sports where should it live? There's lots of places in Pennsylvania. It could belong. It could sit in the Lottery Commission. It could stay forever in the Attorney General's office. So if we could just hear from each one of you on where you believe that regulation should live, and Mark, you should expand on where you believe it should live in Arizona. And we should say that Arizona is one of the states where daily fantasy sports is not played. It never has been.
It's been played, but not when a third party can get part of the profit or money from it.
Yes.
So,
yes. Okay.
Oh, well, yes, I'll answer the question now, apparently. The short answer is I've been a big believer that when it comes to state gaming, gambling policy, that it's best to have a holistic approach where I think there's one agency that would be responsible for overseeing it. Because all these issues crop up, and especially states that have tribal gaming, where a lot of compacts provide exclusivity or limit the number of facilities. Some states have statutes that limit the number of gambling or operating licenses they provide. So when you have one department that's responsible for overseeing everything from the racetracks to the casinos to the lottery to whether making these determinations about charitable gaming, social gambling, whether something does fit into the category of gambling or not, you then have one holistic, consistent approach. And so if somebody's operating, whether it's daily fantasy sports, they want to open a racetrack, or the state wants to sell lottery tickets, there's one place where people can go to get a consistent public policy, and then the regulatory approach could be based on what type of activity it is. So if you have a state lottery, maybe you need less regulation because the amount being wagered and the protections that are already in place in many state laws. And then with other new forms of gaming, maybe you have a different set of regulation. But you have one authority that would be responsible for promulgating or enforcing those types of rules and regulations.
Well, you have states that don't have any gaming, and so don't have gaming authorities or gaming boards. And if you look at it as primarily consumer issues, at this stage how Massachusetts did, then the experience and the ability to oversee that through uniform issuance of regulations, enforcement of regulations on the consumer protection side is, you could argue equally well in that organization, an AG's organization, because you're looking at consumer protection, complaints that come from consumers, as opposed to, the model of casinos where you allow in something, it's basically like a utility. You give it a license, and then they have limited competition, and there's a reason that you have a gaming authority. We put a lot of thought into that piece of it in Massachusetts. This is different to my mind. This is a cutting-edge, high-tech consumer game that involves payment of a fee, that involves necessarily transparency, so that people pay their taxes on their winnings and that consumers are protected. But I don't necessarily agree that you need either to establish or create or put into a gaming commission the oversight of this consumer game at this stage.
Well, I should say I have a completely open mind right now about where regulation should be in Pennsylvania. However, I will also say that in Pennsylvania, the Gaming Control Board, which I am a member of, does have more experience in regulation of gaming because of our role in casino gaming. And when you look at the internet feature of this type of entertainment, it's similar perhaps to internet gaming, and although we don't have internet gaming yet in Pennsylvania, the General Assembly has had bills in front of it for the last couple of years. Every year we're told this is the year that we're going to get internet gaming in Pennsylvania, but in each of the bills introduced, the Gaming Board is given regulatory authority over internet gaming, so that would be a rational extension. But again, from Pennsylvania's standpoint, there's still so many questions in my mind to be answered. But clearly, experience in gaming and being able to deal with a particular type of entertainment fairly and not be heavy-handed, they have to be critical components of solid regulation, no doubt about that.
So if you look to me, Laurie, to the extent that I have a role here on the federal side, I'd say that Congress, as you see all this activity going on in the states, particularly this Congress, is deferential to state authorities. What you have to look at from the federal perspective is whether to be willing to preempt all the activity in the states. That's not the inclination of the leadership at this point. Oversight, will develop other issues in the gambling that we talked about in the other panel, have a federal perspective. You've got PASPA, which we talked about, UGF. But I think largely right now, they'll be watching what the states are doing, seeing how it plays out, and I think being deferential.
Thank you. I believe we're out of time. I just want to say thank you to Villanova. Thank you for inviting us. And I'm sure next year that there will be a completely different story to tell with respect to the regulations. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, my name is Patrick Dowdy. Thank you all for staying around for the whole afternoon. I guess we stretched a little long. Thanks for coming. I really enjoyed putting this panel together. I hope you all learned a lot. Panelists were great. I want to thank the panelists and the moderators again. They did a terrific job today. I also want to thank Andrew Brandt and Vincent Castro, who have just been instrumental in putting this whole thing together. And of course, Jeff Morad, wherever he went. He's for providing this whole stage, really, for us to go forward in sports law and giving us the opportunity to really experience this kind of law. So thank you, and go Nova.